Question 1. Operational review demonstrates that a long-standing client who has previously expressed a strong interest in a particular type of structured product is now requesting advice on investing in a newly launched, complex structured note. The client explicitly states they want to invest in this specific note, citing its perceived unique features. The advisor has a general understanding of structured products, but has not yet conducted a detailed analysis of this specific note or its suitability for the client's current circumstances. What is the most appropriate course of action for the advisor? Option A. Proceed with recommending the structured note as requested by the client, given their stated preference and prior interest in similar products. Option B. Inform the client that the product is too complex and recommend a simpler, more conventional investment product without further investigation. Option C. Conduct a thorough suitability assessment, documenting the client's financial situation, investment objectives, risk tolerance, and knowledge, and then evaluate the specific structured note against these criteria before making any recommendation. Option D. Research the basic features of the structured note, and if it appears generally reasonable, proceed with the recommendation to satisfy the client's request. Correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough suitability assessment, documenting the client's financial situation, investment objectives, risk tolerance, and knowledge, and then evaluate the specific structured note against these criteria before making any recommendation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preference and the advisor's fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest. The advisor must navigate the client's desire for a specific, potentially suboptimal, investment product while upholding regulatory obligations to ensure suitability and prevent misrepresentation. The advanced nature of the Bennett mechanical test implies a need for sophisticated understanding of client needs and regulatory compliance, moving beyond simple product placement. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough, documented assessment of the client's financial situation, investment objectives, risk tolerance, and knowledge of investments. This aligns with the core principles of client-centric advice mandated by regulatory frameworks governing financial professionals. Specifically, it reflects the duty to conduct a comprehensive suitability assessment before recommending any investment. This process ensures that any recommendation, including one for a specific product, is demonstrably in the client's best interest and aligns with their personal circumstances. The documentation of this process is crucial for demonstrating compliance and protecting both the client and the advisor. Incorrect approach is analysis, recommending the product solely based on the client's stated preference, without a suitability assessment, constitutes a failure to meet the fiduciary duty and regulatory requirements for suitability. This approach prioritizes client satisfaction over client well-being, potentially exposing the client to undue risk or unsuitable investment characteristics. It also risks misrepresenting the product's suitability. Proceeding with the recommendation without fully understanding the product's complexities and potential downsides, even after a suitability assessment, is also problematic. It suggests a lack of due diligence and a failure to adequately inform the client of all material risks and benefits, which is a breach of disclosure obligations. Ignoring the client's preference entirely and solely recommending alternative products without a clear, documented rationale tied to suitability would also be a failure. While the advisor must ensure suitability, dismissing a client's expressed interest without a valid, explained reason can damage the client relationship and may not fully address the client's underlying needs or concerns that led to their initial preference. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with understanding the client's holistic financial picture. This involves active listening, probing questions, and a commitment to gathering all necessary information. The next step is to analyze this information against regulatory requirements for suitability and the advisor's own ethical code. Any recommendation must then be clearly communicated to the client, explaining the rationale, risks, and benefits, and ensuring the client understands the implications. Documentation at each stage is paramount to demonstrate adherence to professional standards and regulatory obligations. Question 2. Process analysis reveals that a financial advisor is considering recommending a particular investment product to a client. The advisor knows that this product offers a significantly higher commission than other suitable alternatives. The client is seeking long-term growth with moderate risk. The advisor has not yet fully assessed the client's specific risk tolerance beyond this general understanding. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory requirements and professional ethics? Option A. Recommend the product with the higher commission, assuming the client will benefit from the potential growth and that the higher commission is a reflection of the product's value. Option B. Recommend a diversified portfolio of lower commission products that collectively offer moderate risk and long-term growth, even if the overall commission generated is lower than for the single higher commission product. Option C. Discuss the commission differences with the client and allow the client to decide which product to invest in, emphasizing the potential for higher returns with the higher commission product. Option D. Conduct a detailed risk assessment and suitability analysis for the client, and recommend the investment product that best meets the client's stated objectives and risk tolerance, regardless of the commission structure. The correct answer is A. Recommend the product with the higher commission, assuming the client will benefit from the potential growth and that the higher commission is a reflection of the product's value. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate financial interest of a client with the long-term integrity of the financial markets and the firm's reputation. The pressure to generate revenue can create a conflict of interest, demanding careful judgment to ensure that client recommendations are not unduly influenced by potential personal or firm gains. Adherence to regulatory standards is paramount, as any deviation can lead to severe penalties and loss of trust. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the client's best interests and adheres strictly to the regulatory framework governing financial advice. This involves conducting thorough due diligence, understanding the client's risk tolerance and financial objectives, and recommending investments that are suitable and appropriate. This aligns with the fiduciary duty often implied or explicitly stated in regulations, requiring advisors to act with loyalty and care towards their clients. It also upholds the principles of fair dealing and market integrity by avoiding manipulative or misleading practices. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that focuses solely on maximizing commission without considering the client's suitability or risk profile is a direct violation of regulatory requirements and ethical standards. This constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty, potentially leading to misrepresentation and unsuitable recommendations, which are subject to significant penalties under financial regulations. An approach that involves recommending complex or speculative products solely because they offer higher fees, without a clear understanding or disclosure of the associated risks to the client, is also a regulatory failure. This can be construed as a conflict of interest and a failure to act in the client's best interest, potentially leading to enforcement actions for misleading practices or failure to supervise. An approach that prioritizes the firm's short-term revenue targets over the client's long-term financial well-being by pushing products that are not genuinely suitable represents a significant ethical lapse and a breach of regulatory obligations. This can lead to accusations of churning or other forms of market abuse, resulting in fines, license revocation, and reputational damage. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the client's needs, objectives, and risk tolerance. This should be followed by a comprehensive assessment of available investment options, considering their suitability, risk, and return profiles. All recommendations must be transparently communicated to the client, with full disclosure of any potential conflicts of interest or fees. Regular review of client portfolios and adherence to ongoing compliance training are essential to maintain ethical and regulatory standards. The ultimate goal is to build long-term client relationships based on trust and sound financial advice, rather than short-term transactional gains. Question 3. Comparative studies suggest that when a client expresses a strong preference for a particular investment strategy that appears to contradict their previously assessed risk tolerance and financial objectives, a financial professional's primary responsibility is to: Option A. Politely decline to advise on the client's preferred strategy and recommend an alternative that the professional deems more appropriate, without extensive explanation of the client's initial preference. Option B. Immediately implement the client's preferred investment strategy to honor their stated wishes, assuming they have fully considered the potential outcomes. Option C. Conduct a detailed review of the client's financial situation and risk tolerance, and then engage in a thorough discussion to explain the implications of their stated preference in light of this assessment, seeking a mutually agreeable and suitable course of action. Option D. Provide a brief overview of the general risks associated with the client's preferred strategy, and then proceed with their request if the client reiterates their desire. The correct answer is C. Conduct a detailed review of the client's financial situation and risk tolerance, and then engage in a thorough discussion to explain the implications of their stated preference in light of this assessment, seeking a mutually agreeable and suitable course of action. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to navigate a situation where a client's stated preference for a particular investment strategy might conflict with their underlying risk tolerance and financial objectives, as revealed by a more detailed assessment. The challenge lies in balancing client autonomy with the fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, ensuring that recommendations are suitable and not merely responsive to a superficial request. This requires careful judgment to avoid misinterpreting client desires as fully informed and appropriate financial decisions. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive understanding of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and objectives before making any recommendations. This aligns with regulatory frameworks that mandate suitability assessments and the fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest. By conducting a thorough review and engaging in a detailed discussion about the implications of different investment strategies, the professional ensures that any proposed course of action is not only aligned with the client's stated preferences, but also genuinely suitable for their circumstances. This proactive and diligent approach mitigates risks for both the client and the professional. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately proceeding with the client's stated preference without further investigation. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement for a suitability assessment. Ethically, it breaches the fiduciary duty by potentially recommending an unsuitable investment, exposing the client to undue risk, or failing to meet their financial goals. This approach prioritizes client satisfaction over client well-being and regulatory compliance. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's preference outright and impose a different strategy based solely on the professional's judgment, without adequately explaining the rationale or exploring the client's underlying reasoning. This undermines client autonomy and can damage the professional relationship. While the intention might be to protect the client, the execution is flawed as it bypasses essential client engagement and collaborative decision-making, potentially leading to a lack of trust and adherence to the recommended strategy. A third incorrect approach is to provide a superficial explanation of the risks associated with the client's preferred strategy, without delving into the specifics of how it conflicts with the client's revealed risk tolerance or financial objectives. This offers a false sense of due diligence. It fails to provide the client with the necessary information to make a truly informed decision and still risks recommending an unsuitable investment, thereby violating regulatory and ethical standards. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with active listening and information gathering. This involves understanding the client's stated goals and preferences. Subsequently, a thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment horizon is crucial. The next step is to analyze how the client's stated preferences align with this comprehensive assessment. If there is a misalignment, the professional must engage in a transparent and educational dialogue with the client, explaining the discrepancies and the potential consequences of each path. The final decision should be a collaborative one, ensuring the client understands and agrees to a strategy that is both suitable and aligned with their informed consent. Question 4. Assessment of how an advisor should proceed when a client, who has previously expressed a desire for conservative investments, now insists on a highly speculative product based on recent market hype, despite the advisor's initial assessment of the client's risk profile indicating this is unsuitable. Option A. Immediately execute the client's request to purchase the speculative product to demonstrate responsiveness and avoid client dissatisfaction, assuming the client is fully aware of the risks. Option B. Politely decline the client's request, stating that the product is too risky for them and that the advisor cannot recommend it without further explanation or exploration of alternatives. Option C. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client to understand the underlying reasons for their sudden interest in the speculative product. Explain the risks and potential downsides in relation to their stated financial goals and risk tolerance, and present alternative, more suitable options that align with their established profile. Option D. Proceed with the purchase of the speculative product, but include a disclaimer in all documentation stating that the client insisted on the investment against the advisor's recommendation. The correct answer is C. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client to understand the underlying reasons for their sudden interest in the speculative product. Explain the risks and potential downsides in relation to their stated financial goals and risk tolerance, and present alternative, more suitable options that align with their established profile. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preference and the advisor's fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, particularly when the client's preference may lead to suboptimal outcomes or increased risk. The advisor must navigate the client's emotional state and potential lack of full understanding of the implications, while adhering to regulatory requirements for suitability and client care. The advanced nature of the Bennett mechanical test implies a need for sophisticated judgment beyond basic product knowledge. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a structured, client-centric decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding the client's underlying needs and objectives before proposing solutions. This aligns with the fiduciary duty mandated by regulations, which requires advisors to place the client's interests above their own and to provide advice that is suitable for the client's circumstances. This approach involves active listening, probing questions to uncover the why behind the client's request, and educating the client on alternatives and their respective risks and benefits. It emphasizes a collaborative process where the advisor acts as a trusted guide, ensuring the client makes an informed decision that truly serves their long-term financial well-being. This is best professional practice as it upholds regulatory standards for client suitability, transparency, and ethical conduct. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately fulfilling the client's request without further inquiry. This fails to meet the regulatory obligation to assess suitability and understand the client's true needs. It risks providing advice that is not in the client's best interest, potentially leading to financial harm and regulatory breaches related to misrepresentation or unsuitable recommendations. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's request outright, without attempting to understand their rationale or educate them on alternatives. This demonstrates a lack of client care and can damage the professional relationship. Ethically, it fails to engage in a dialogue that could lead to a better outcome for the client and may violate principles of good faith and fair dealing. A third incorrect approach is to focus solely on the technical specifications of the client's request without considering the broader financial implications or the client's overall financial plan. This narrow focus ignores the holistic nature of financial advice and the regulatory expectation that recommendations be integrated within the client's complete financial picture. It can lead to recommendations that are technically sound but financially detrimental in the long run, violating suitability requirements. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the client's objectives, risk tolerance, and financial situation. This involves active listening and asking open-ended questions to uncover the client's motivations. Following this, the advisor should explain the implications of various options, including the client's preferred course of action, in clear, understandable terms, highlighting potential risks and benefits. The advisor should then present suitable alternatives that align with the client's best interests and regulatory requirements. The final decision should be a joint one, based on informed consent and a clear understanding of the chosen path. This iterative process ensures that advice is not only compliant, but also genuinely beneficial to the client. Question 5. When evaluating a client's request to use the Bennett Mechanical Test Advanced Practice Test results to predict long-term career success in a field not directly assessed by the test, what is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Suggest that the test results, while not directly applicable, can be used as a supplementary factor in a broader career counseling process, without making specific predictions about long-term success. Option B. Advise the client that the Bennett Mechanical Test is a definitive predictor of all forms of career success, and proceed with a detailed interpretation of how the results directly translate to their chosen field. Option C. Proceed with interpreting the test results in the context of the client's desired career, making reasonable inferences about their potential for success based on the test's general aptitude measures. Option D. Explain the limitations of the Bennett mechanical test and recommend alternative assessment methods or resources that are better suited for predicting long-term career success in the specified field. The correct answer is D. Explain the limitations of the Bennett mechanical test and recommend alternative assessment methods or resources that are better suited for predicting long-term career success in the specified field. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate conflicting pressures and potential conflicts of interest while adhering to the principles of the Bennett mechanical test advanced practice test. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the desire to provide a comprehensive and potentially beneficial service with the imperative to operate strictly within the defined scope and ethical boundaries of the test's application. Careful judgment is required to avoid overstepping professional responsibilities or misrepresenting the capabilities and intended use of the test. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes accurate representation and responsible application of the Bennett mechanical test. It acknowledges the test's purpose and limitations, ensuring that any recommendations or interpretations are grounded in the test's established validity and reliability. This aligns with the ethical obligation to provide services that are both competent and appropriate, avoiding any actions that could mislead clients or misapply the test's findings. Adherence to the test's intended use and the professional standards governing its administration and interpretation is paramount. An incorrect approach that involves extending the interpretation of the test results beyond their validated scope would represent a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This could lead to misinformed decisions by the client, potentially causing harm or disadvantage. It also undermines the integrity of the test itself and the professional's credibility. Another incorrect approach, such as using the test results to justify unrelated or speculative conclusions, would similarly violate professional standards by misrepresenting the test's predictive or diagnostic power. This constitutes a failure to uphold the principle of evidence-based practice and could be seen as a form of professional misconduct. The professional decision-making framework for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the test's purpose, limitations, and the governing regulatory framework. Professionals must critically assess requests and situations to determine if they fall within the appropriate application of the test. When in doubt, seeking clarification from authoritative sources or consulting with experienced peers is advisable. A commitment to ongoing professional development and a strong ethical compass are essential for navigating complex scenarios and ensuring that professional actions are always aligned with best practices and regulatory requirements. Question 6. Market research demonstrates that a significant portion of retail investors express a strong preference for investments with high perceived social impact, even if these investments carry higher risk profiles and lower historical returns compared to more conventional options. You are advising a client who has explicitly stated they wish to invest a substantial portion of their portfolio in a specific, high-risk, unproven social impact fund, citing personal values as the primary driver. Your analysis indicates this fund is not suitable for the client's stated financial goals and risk tolerance. What is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive suitability assessment. Clearly document the risks and limitations of the preferred fund. Explain why it does not align with the client's financial objectives and risk tolerance, and propose alternative, suitable investments that also meet their social impact criteria. Option B. Investigate the social impact fund further to find any possible justification for its suitability, even if it means downplaying some of the identified risks to accommodate the client's strong preference. Option C. Advise the client that their preference is unsuitable and immediately recommend a completely different investment strategy that you deem more appropriate, without further discussion of their preferred fund. Option D. Proceed with the client's requested investment in the social impact fund to honor their stated preference and maintain the client relationship, assuming their personal values justify the deviation from standard suitability metrics. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive suitability assessment. clearly document the risks and limitations of the preferred fund, explain why it does not align with the client's financial objectives and risk tolerance, and propose alternative, suitable investments that also meet their social impact criteria. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preference and the advisor's fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, especially when that preference might lead to suboptimal outcomes or regulatory breaches. The advisor must navigate the client's desire for a specific, potentially unsuitable, investment with the obligation to provide objective, suitable advice. This requires careful judgment to balance client autonomy with professional responsibility. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough, documented process of understanding the client's objectives, risk tolerance, and financial situation, and then clearly explaining why the client's preferred investment is not suitable. This aligns with the fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, which is paramount under relevant financial regulations. It requires providing alternative, suitable recommendations and educating the client on the rationale, ensuring transparency and informed consent. This approach upholds regulatory requirements for suitability and client care. Incorrect approaches analysis. Recommending the client's preferred investment without a rigorous suitability assessment or adequate disclosure of risks and drawbacks constitutes a failure to meet the fiduciary duty and regulatory obligations. This could lead to significant client harm and regulatory sanctions. Agreeing to the client's request solely to maintain the relationship or avoid confrontation without addressing the suitability concerns is also a breach of professional ethics and regulatory standards. Ignoring the client's preference entirely and proceeding with a completely different strategy without adequate explanation and client buy-in can lead to a breakdown in trust and a failure to meet the client's underlying, albeit potentially misdirected, needs. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that prioritizes client best interests, regulatory compliance, and ethical conduct. This involves 1. Discovery, thoroughly understanding the client's situation, objectives, and preferences. 2. Assessment, evaluating the suitability of any proposed course of action against client needs and regulatory requirements. 3. Recommendation, presenting clear, objective advice including alternatives and rationale. 4. Education, ensuring the client understands the implications of their decisions. 5. Documentation, maintaining a clear record of all advice, discussions, and decisions. Question 7. Market research demonstrates that a significant portion of investors express a strong emotional attachment to specific, often underperforming, legacy investments. You are advising a client who insists on maintaining a substantial allocation to such an investment, despite your analysis indicating it is no longer suitable for their evolving financial goals and risk tolerance. How should you proceed to uphold your professional obligations? Option A. Recommend divesting the legacy investment immediately and reallocating the funds to a diversified portfolio without acknowledging the client's emotional attachment or providing alternative options. Option B. Inform the client that their preference is not aligned with sound investment principles and proceed with a recommended portfolio that excludes the legacy investment without further discussion. Option C. Proceed with the client's preferred allocation to the legacy investment to maintain client satisfaction, even if it deviates from your professional assessment of suitability. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive review of the client's overall financial situation and investment objectives, and then present a clear, evidence-based recommendation that addresses the suitability concerns of the legacy investment, offering suitable alternatives while respecting the client's ultimate decision-making authority. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive review of the client's overall financial situation and investment objectives, and then present a clear, evidence-based recommendation that addresses the suitability concerns of the legacy investment, offering suitable alternatives while respecting the client's ultimate decision-making authority. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preference and the advisor's fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest. The advisor must navigate the client's emotional attachment to a specific investment, which may not align with sound financial principles or regulatory requirements for suitability. The advisor's judgment is critical to ensure the client's financial well-being, is prioritized over potentially misguided personal preferences. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing the client's best interests, a core tenet of fiduciary duty. This involves a thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment objectives, followed by providing objective, evidence-based recommendations. The advisor must clearly articulate the rationale behind their advice, explaining the risks and potential downsides of the client's preferred investment and highlighting suitable alternatives. This aligns with regulatory frameworks that mandate suitability and a client-centric approach, ensuring that investment recommendations are appropriate for the individual's circumstances. Incorrect approaches analysis. Recommending the client's preferred investment without due diligence, despite concerns about its suitability, constitutes a failure to uphold the fiduciary duty. This could lead to regulatory breaches related to suitability rules and potentially expose the client to undue risk. Agreeing to the client's request solely to maintain the relationship, without addressing the underlying suitability issues, is also a failure to act in the client's best interest and could be seen as a breach of ethical standards. Ignoring the client's concerns and proceeding with a different recommendation without adequate explanation or client engagement fails to respect the client's autonomy and can erode trust, potentially leading to complaints and regulatory scrutiny for poor client communication and a lack of client centricity. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the client's stated needs and preferences. This is followed by a rigorous assessment of the client's financial profile and objectives. The next step involves evaluating potential investment options against these criteria, identifying any discrepancies between the client's preferences and suitable recommendations. The professional must then engage in transparent and open communication with the client, explaining the rationale for their recommendations, addressing concerns, and collaboratively arriving at a decision that aligns with both the client's best interests and regulatory requirements. Question 8. Upon reviewing a client's request to invest a significant portion of their portfolio in a highly speculative, illiquid asset class that they have recently become interested in, despite their stated conservative risk tolerance and long-term financial goals, what is the most appropriate course of action for the financial advisor? Option A. Conduct a thorough assessment of the client's understanding of the risks and potential downsides of the proposed investment. Explain how it conflicts with their stated risk tolerance and long-term goals, and present alternative, more suitable investment options that align with their objectives. Option B. Proceed with the investment as requested by the client, as their instructions are paramount and the advisor's role is to execute their wishes. Option C. Strongly advocate for the client to accept the advisor's recommended diversified portfolio, emphasizing the speculative nature of their request and discouraging further discussion on the matter. Option D. Advise the client that their request is incompatible with their profile and suggest they seek advice elsewhere if they are determined to proceed with this specific investment. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough assessment of the client's understanding of the risks and potential downsides of the proposed investment. Explain how it conflicts with their stated risk tolerance and long-term goals, and present alternative, more suitable investment options that align with their objectives. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preference and the advisor's fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, particularly when the client's preference may lead to suboptimal outcomes or increased risk. The advisor must navigate this by applying a structured decision-making framework that prioritizes client well-being and regulatory compliance. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it upholds the advisor's fiduciary duty. This involves thoroughly understanding the client's objectives, risk tolerance, and financial situation, and then providing recommendations that are demonstrably in the client's best interest, even if they differ from the client's initial inclination. This aligns with regulatory requirements that mandate suitability and a client-centric approach, ensuring that advice is objective and tailored to the individual's needs. Ethical guidelines also emphasize transparency and the obligation to educate clients about the implications of their choices. An incorrect approach that solely prioritizes the client's stated preference without due diligence fails to meet the fiduciary standard. This could lead to recommendations that are unsuitable, exposing the client to undue risk or suboptimal returns, which is a direct violation of regulatory obligations to act in the client's best interest. Another incorrect approach, which involves pressuring the client to accept the advisor's recommendation without fully exploring the client's rationale or concerns, breaches ethical principles of respect for client autonomy and can create an adversarial relationship, undermining trust and potentially leading to regulatory scrutiny for undue influence. A third incorrect approach, which involves disengaging from the client due to a disagreement, fails to fulfill the advisor's professional responsibility to provide guidance and explore alternatives, potentially leaving the client vulnerable to making a poor decision without informed advice. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with active listening and comprehensive data gathering to understand the client's full context. This is followed by objective analysis of available options, considering suitability and alignment with client goals. Crucially, the framework includes clear, transparent communication of recommendations, explaining the rationale and potential consequences, and then collaboratively working with the client to reach a mutually agreeable and suitable course of action. This process ensures that client interests are paramount and regulatory requirements are met. Question 9. During the evaluation of a client's request to invest a significant portion of their portfolio into a highly speculative, illiquid asset class, what is the most appropriate initial course of action for a financial advisor? Option A. Recommend the investment to the client, highlighting the potential for high returns while downplaying the associated risks. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive review of the client's overall financial situation, risk tolerance, and long-term objectives to determine the suitability of the requested investment. Option C. Inform the client that their request cannot be fulfilled due to the speculative nature of the asset class without further discussion. Option D. Immediately proceed with the investment as requested by the client to ensure client satisfaction and avoid potential dissatisfaction. The correct answer is B. Conduct a comprehensive review of the client's overall financial situation, risk tolerance, and long-term objectives to determine the suitability of the requested investment. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the client's stated objectives with the advisor's fiduciary duty and understanding of the regulatory environment. The advisor must navigate potential conflicts of interest and ensure that recommendations are suitable and in the client's best interest, rather than simply fulfilling a direct request that might be ill-advised or misaligned with broader financial goals. The pressure to satisfy a client's specific, potentially short-sighted, request can create a tension with the advisor's obligation to provide objective, well-reasoned advice. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough assessment of the client's overall financial situation, risk tolerance, and long-term objectives before directly addressing the specific investment request. This aligns with the principles of Know Your Client (KIC) and suitability requirements mandated by regulatory bodies. By understanding the client's complete financial picture, the advisor can determine if the requested investment is appropriate. If not, explain why and propose suitable alternatives. This demonstrates adherence to the fiduciary standard, which requires acting solely in the client's best interest and upholds regulatory obligations to prevent unsuitable investments. Incorrect approaches analysis. Recommending the investment without further inquiry fails to meet the suitability requirements. This approach prioritizes the client's immediate request over their long-term well-being and could lead to an investment that is too risky, illiquid, or otherwise inappropriate for their circumstances. This constitutes a breach of the fiduciary duty and regulatory obligations to ensure investment suitability. Proceeding with the investment solely based on the client's insistence without a proper suitability assessment also ignores the advisor's professional responsibility to provide informed guidance and could expose both the client and the advisor to significant risk. This bypasses the essential due diligence expected of a financial professional. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive understanding of the client's needs and objectives. This involves active listening, detailed information gathering, and a thorough risk assessment. When a client makes a specific request, the advisor's role is to evaluate that request within the context of the client's overall financial plan and regulatory guidelines. If the request is unsuitable, the advisor must clearly and professionally explain the reasons, referencing relevant risks and offering alternative suitable solutions. This process ensures that advice is objective, client-centric, and compliant with all applicable regulations. Question 10. The evaluation methodology shows that a critical component in a high-stress mechanical assembly has experienced a significant impact, leading to a visible deformation and a reduction in its operational efficiency. The impact assessment report details the force vector and magnitude of the impact, but does not explicitly state the long-term consequences or the precise failure mechanism. Which of the following represents the most appropriate professional response to this situation? Option A. Recommend immediate replacement of the deformed component and a review of the assembly's operational parameters to prevent future occurrences. Option B. Conduct a detailed stress analysis to determine the extent of internal damage, potential for fatigue, and the impact on adjacent components before proposing any remediation. Option C. Focus on restoring the component's original shape through external force application, assuming that visual integrity implies functional integrity. Option D. Advise that the deformation is minor and likely within acceptable tolerances, suggesting only a cosmetic repair. The correct answer is A. Recommend immediate replacement of the deformed component and a review of the assembly's operational parameters to prevent future occurrences. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the Bennett Mechanical Test Advanced Practice Test is designed to assess a candidate's understanding of mechanical principles and their application in practical, often complex, situations. The challenge lies in accurately interpreting the results of an impact assessment, which involves understanding how forces and stresses interact with mechanical components. A candidate must move beyond simply identifying a problem to proposing a solution that is both technically sound and compliant with relevant industry standards and safety regulations, which are implicitly tested through the application of mechanical principles. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it demonstrates a comprehensive understanding of the impact assessment's implications. It involves not just identifying the immediate mechanical failure, but also considering the cascading effects on the entire system and the potential safety hazards. This aligns with the professional responsibility to ensure the integrity and safety of mechanical systems, a core tenet implicitly assessed by the Bennett Mechanical Test. Adhering to established engineering principles and best practices, as demonstrated by a thorough analysis of the impact and its consequences, is paramount. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on superficial damage without investigating the underlying cause fails to meet professional standards. This could lead to recurring failures and potential safety risks, violating the implicit requirement for robust problem-solving and risk mitigation. Another incorrect approach that proposes a quick fix without considering long-term structural integrity or material fatigue would be professionally unacceptable. This overlooks the need for sustainable solutions and could result in premature system failure, contravening the principles of sound engineering design and maintenance. A third incorrect approach that ignores potential regulatory noncompliance, such as failing to meet specific load-bearing requirements or safety standards, is ethically and professionally deficient. This demonstrates a lack of awareness of the broader context in which mechanical systems operate and the legal and safety frameworks that govern them. Professionals should approach such situations by first thoroughly understanding the problem through detailed analysis of the impact assessment data. This involves identifying the root cause of the failure, not just the symptoms. Subsequently, they should evaluate potential solutions based on their technical feasibility, cost-effectiveness, and, crucially, their adherence to all applicable safety regulations and industry best practices. This systematic process ensures that the chosen solution is not only effective in the short term, but also contributes to the long-term reliability and safety of the mechanical system. Question 11. Consider a scenario where an advanced practice professional is developing a new diagnostic protocol based on their experience with a complex case. To refine this protocol and ensure its effectiveness, they wish to discuss specific, albeit anonymized, aspects of the case with a peer group for feedback. The professional has taken steps to remove all direct and indirect identifiers from the case details. What is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Refrain from sharing any details of the case, even anonymized, to strictly adhere to confidentiality principles and avoid any potential risk of re-identification. Option B. Share the anonymized case details with the peer group, but also include a brief, non-identifying description of the client's demographic to provide context for the case. Option C. Share the anonymized case details with the peer group, clearly stating that all identifying information has been removed and request their expert feedback on the protocol. Option D. Share the anonymized case details with the peer group, without explicitly stating that identifiers have been removed, assuming the anonymization is sufficient. The correct answer is C. Share the anonymized case details with the peer group, clearly stating that all identifying information has been removed, and request their expert feedback on the protocol. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need for information with the obligation to protect sensitive client data. The advanced practice professional must exercise careful judgment to determine the appropriate level of detail to share without breaching confidentiality or compromising the integrity of the ongoing assessment. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes client confidentiality and data security, which are fundamental ethical and regulatory obligations. By seeking to anonymize the data and obtaining explicit consent, the professional adheres to principles of data protection and client trust. This aligns with the spirit of regulations that mandate safeguarding sensitive information while still allowing for necessary professional collaboration and knowledge sharing. An incorrect approach that involves sharing identifiable client information without consent represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This breaches client confidentiality, violates data protection laws, and erodes trust. It could lead to disciplinary action, legal penalties, and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach, which is to refuse to share any information even in an anonymized format, fails to contribute to the broader professional understanding and potentially hinders the development of best practices, although it prioritizes confidentiality. However, a more nuanced approach that seeks to anonymize and obtain consent is generally preferred when possible. A third incorrect approach, which is to share the information with colleagues without any attempt at anonymization or consent, is a direct violation of privacy and data protection regulations, exposing the client to potential harm and the professional to severe repercussions. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the core ethical and regulatory obligations. This involves understanding the sensitivity of the information, the potential risks of disclosure, and the legal requirements for data handling. The next step is to explore all possible avenues for achieving the desired outcome, e.g., knowledge sharing, while minimizing risks. This includes considering anonymization techniques, seeking informed consent, and consulting with relevant ethical or legal advisors if uncertainty exists. The decision should always err on the side of caution when client confidentiality and data security are at stake. Question 12. The review process indicates that a client has expressed a strong preference for a particular investment strategy that appears to carry a higher risk profile than the advisor's initial assessment of the client's risk tolerance would suggest. The advisor is concerned that this preferred strategy may not be fully aligned with the client's long-term financial goals and overall financial situation. Which of the following approaches best reflects the required impact assessment and professional responsibility in this situation? Option A. Proceed with recommending the client's preferred strategy as requested, prioritizing client satisfaction and avoiding potential conflict, as the client is ultimately responsible for their investment decisions. Option B. Immediately dismiss the client's preferred strategy as unsuitable without further analysis, and unilaterally recommend a more conservative investment approach that the advisor deems appropriate. Option C. Conduct a detailed impact assessment of the client's preferred strategy, considering its alignment with their stated objectives, risk tolerance, time horizon, and financial capacity, and then clearly communicate the findings and any recommended adjustments or alternative suitable options to the client. Option D. Focus the impact assessment solely on the potential negative consequences of not following the client's preference, such as losing their business, and adjust the recommendation accordingly to mitigate this risk. The correct answer is C. Conduct a detailed impact assessment of the client's preferred strategy, considering its alignment with their stated objectives, risk tolerance, time horizon, and financial capacity, and then clearly communicate the findings and any recommended adjustments or alternative suitable options to the client. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preference for a particular investment strategy and the advisor's fiduciary duty to recommend suitable investments based on a comprehensive understanding of the client's circumstances. The advisor must navigate the potential for client dissatisfaction if their preferred strategy is deemed unsuitable, while simultaneously upholding regulatory obligations and ethical standards. The pressure to satisfy the client's immediate desire must be balanced against the long-term implications of inappropriate investment recommendations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves conducting a thorough impact assessment that goes beyond the client's stated preference. This requires a deep dive into the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, investment objectives, time horizon, and knowledge of financial products. The advisor must then objectively evaluate how the client's preferred strategy aligns with these factors. If the preferred strategy is not suitable, the advisor must clearly articulate the reasons for this assessment, referencing relevant regulatory requirements for suitability and client best interests. This approach upholds the advisor's fiduciary duty, ensures compliance with regulations that mandate suitability assessments, and prioritizes the client's long-term financial well-being over short-term client satisfaction. It demonstrates professional integrity and a commitment to ethical practice. Incorrect approach is analysis. Recommending the client's preferred strategy without a comprehensive suitability assessment, despite concerns about its appropriateness, represents a failure to adhere to the core principles of client best interest and suitability mandated by regulatory frameworks. This approach prioritizes client appeasement over professional responsibility, potentially exposing the client to undue risk and leading to regulatory sanctions for the advisor. Focusing solely on the potential for immediate client dissatisfaction as the primary driver for the recommendation, without adequately considering the objective suitability of the investment, is an ethical lapse. It suggests a prioritization of business retention over the client's financial welfare, which is contrary to fiduciary duties. Ignoring the client's stated preference entirely and unilaterally recommending a different strategy without a clear, well-reasoned explanation tied to suitability and client objectives could also be problematic. While the advisor has a duty to recommend suitable investments, a complete disregard for the client's input without proper communication can erode trust and lead to a breakdown in the professional relationship, potentially creating a perception of paternalism rather than partnership. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with a comprehensive understanding of the client's needs and objectives. This involves active listening, thorough data gathering, and objective analysis. When a client expresses a specific preference, the advisor's role is to critically evaluate that preference against established suitability criteria and regulatory requirements. The process should involve transparent communication with the client, explaining the rationale behind any recommendations, especially when they diverge from the client's initial desires. If a preferred strategy is deemed unsuitable, the advisor must clearly articulate the risks and reasons, offering suitable alternatives that align with the client's overall financial picture. This approach fosters trust, ensures compliance, and ultimately serves the client's best interests. Question 13. Which approach would be most effective in assessing the potential impact of a new financial services regulation on an existing investment product, considering the need for thoroughness without excessive resource expenditure? Option A. Performing an exhaustive, item-by-item analysis of every conceivable minor detail within the regulation, regardless of its direct relevance to the product. Option B. Relying on informal discussions with industry peers and a quick review of industry news to gauge the general sentiment regarding the regulation's impact. Option C. Conducting a detailed analysis of the regulation's specific clauses and their direct and indirect implications for the product's structure, marketing, and client suitability, supported by relevant data and expert consultation. Option D. Assuming the regulation will have minimal effect on the product unless specific, obvious conflicts are immediately apparent, and proceeding with business as usual. The correct answer is C. Conducting a detailed analysis of the regulation's specific clauses and their direct and indirect implications for the product's structure, marketing, and client suitability, supported by relevant data and expert consultation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent uncertainty in predicting the precise impact of a proposed regulatory change on a specific financial product. The challenge lies in balancing the need for thorough due diligence with the practical constraints of time and available information. A superficial assessment risks misrepresenting the product's suitability or exposing the firm to regulatory scrutiny, while an overly exhaustive analysis might delay crucial decision-making. Professional judgment, is required to identify the most relevant factors and assess their potential impact with a reasonable degree of confidence. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic and evidence-based assessment of the proposed regulatory changes' potential effects on the product's design, marketing, and client suitability. This includes identifying key provisions of the new regulation, analyzing how they directly or indirectly alter the product's characteristics, and evaluating the implications for client risk profiles and disclosure requirements. This method aligns with the professional duty of care and the regulatory obligation to ensure that financial products are offered in a manner that is fair, transparent, and in the best interests of clients. It demonstrates a proactive and responsible approach to regulatory compliance, minimizing the risk of future breaches. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to dismiss the regulatory change as having no significant impact without a detailed review. This fails to acknowledge the potential for unforeseen consequences and demonstrates a lack of diligence, potentially violating regulatory requirements for ongoing product oversight and suitability assessments. It could lead to the continued offering of a product that is no longer compliant or appropriate for clients. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on anecdotal evidence or the opinions of a few colleagues. This is not a robust method for impact assessment and lacks the necessary objectivity and thoroughness. It risks perpetuating misinformation and failing to identify genuine risks, which could result in regulatory sanctions for inadequate risk management and compliance procedures. A third incorrect approach would be to conduct an overly broad and unfocused analysis that attempts to quantify every conceivable minor impact. While thoroughness is important, an approach that lacks clear objectives and prioritization can become inefficient and may not effectively identify the most critical risks. This can lead to wasted resources and a failure to address the most material issues, potentially still leaving the firm exposed to regulatory non-compliance in key areas. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured approach to impact assessment. This involves 1. Understanding the proposed regulation thoroughly. 2. Identifying the specific product features and client segments that are most likely to be affected. 3. Gathering relevant data and expert opinions. 4. Analyzing the potential positive and negative impacts, considering both direct and indirect effects. 5. Documenting the assessment process and conclusions. 6. Developing a plan to mitigate identified risks and implement necessary changes. This systematic process ensures that decisions are informed, compliant, and aligned with professional standards. Question 14. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a new regulatory directive concerning enhanced disclosure requirements for complex derivative products is imminent. Which of the following approaches best aligns with proactive and comprehensive impact assessment for a firm's proprietary trading desk dealing in these instruments? Option A. Wait for the regulation to be officially published and for market participants to demonstrate its practical effects before commencing any impact assessment. Option B. Conduct a detailed analysis of the direct financial costs associated with implementing the new disclosure systems and update trading models to reflect any immediate changes in capital allocation. Option C. Focus exclusively on the potential for increased compliance fines if the new disclosure requirements are not met, without evaluating broader strategic or operational implications. Option D. Initiate a thorough review of the regulatory text to identify all potential operational, market, and client-related consequences, including how the enhanced disclosures might influence trading strategies and client demand. The correct answer is B. Conduct a detailed analysis of the direct financial costs associated with implementing the new disclosure systems and update trading models to reflect any immediate changes in capital allocation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent uncertainty in predicting the precise impact of a new regulatory change on a specific financial product. The firm must balance the need for proactive risk management with the potential for overreaction or misinterpretation of the regulatory intent. The challenge lies in translating a broad regulatory directive into actionable impact assessments for a complex financial instrument, requiring a nuanced understanding of both the regulation and the product's mechanics. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a multifaceted impact assessment that considers both quantitative and qualitative factors. This includes analyzing the direct financial implications, e.g., changes in capital requirements, transaction costs, and the indirect effects, e.g., market sentiment, client behavior, operational adjustments. This comprehensive view ensures that all potential risks and opportunities stemming from the regulation are identified and evaluated, aligning with the principle of prudent risk management mandated by regulatory frameworks. It demonstrates a commitment to understanding the full scope of regulatory influence, which is a cornerstone of compliance and sound business practice. Incorrect approach is analysis, focusing solely on immediate, quantifiable financial impacts without considering qualitative factors or potential behavioral shifts, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This narrow perspective can lead to an incomplete risk profile, potentially exposing the firm to unforeseen consequences. It neglects the broader implications of regulatory changes, such as reputational damage or operational disruption, which are equally critical to manage. Adopting a reactive stance, waiting for concrete evidence of impact before initiating an assessment, is a direct contravention of proactive risk management principles. Regulations are designed to prevent future harm, and a delayed assessment means the firm is operating without a clear understanding of its exposure, thereby failing to meet its duty of care to clients and the market. This approach also risks falling behind competitors who are more agile in their risk assessment. Ignoring the potential impact on client behavior and market perception is another critical failure. Financial markets are driven by sentiment and client actions, which can amplify or mitigate the direct effects of a regulation. A failure to consider these dynamics means the assessment is fundamentally flawed, leading to potentially inaccurate risk mitigation strategies. This oversight can result in mispricing of risk, inadequate hedging, and ultimately, financial losses. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach regulatory impact assessments with a framework that prioritizes a holistic and forward-looking perspective. This involves 1. Understanding the regulatory intent and scope thoroughly. 2. Identifying all potential channels of impact, both direct and indirect. 3. Employing a combination of quantitative modeling and qualitative expert judgment. 4. Scenario planning to explore a range of possible outcomes. 5. Engaging with relevant stakeholders, e.g., legal, compliance, business lines to gather diverse perspectives. 6. Establishing clear triggers for reassessment as the regulatory landscape evolves or new information becomes available. This systematic and comprehensive approach ensures that risk management is robust, compliant, and aligned with the firm's strategic objectives. Question 15. The efficiency study reveals that a mechanical contractor's recently completed project has been met with client dissatisfaction regarding perceived operational inefficiencies. The client is withholding final payment, citing these issues. What is the most appropriate initial professional response for the contractor to address this situation? Option A. Immediately issue a final invoice for the full contract amount and inform the client that legal action will be pursued if payment is not received within a specified time frame. Option B. Offer a substantial, unquantified reduction in the final invoice to appease the client and avoid further conflict, regardless of the validity of their claims. Option C. Initiate a formal impact assessment to objectively evaluate the client's claims of inefficiency and their quantifiable effects on the project's performance against agreed-upon standards. Option D. Proceed with filing a lien against the property for the outstanding balance without further communication or investigation into the client's concerns. The correct answer is C. Initiate a formal impact assessment to objectively evaluate the client's claims of inefficiency and their quantifiable effects on the project's performance against agreed-upon standards. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge where a mechanical contractor, having completed a project, faces a situation where the client is withholding final payment due to perceived inefficiencies. The challenge lies in balancing the contractor's right to payment for services rendered against the client's right to a satisfactory outcome, all within the bounds of contractual obligations and industry standards. The contractor must navigate this dispute without resorting to immediate legal action, which can be costly and damage future business relationships. The core of the challenge is to objectively assess the client's claims of inefficiency and determine the appropriate course of action based on the project's scope, specifications, and any agreed-upon performance metrics. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves initiating a formal impact assessment process. This is best professional practice because it provides a structured, objective, and documented method for evaluating the client's claims. By engaging in an impact assessment, the contractor demonstrates a commitment to understanding and addressing legitimate concerns, fostering goodwill and a collaborative resolution. This process aligns with ethical principles of fairness and transparency. From a regulatory perspective, while specific regulations for impact assessment in this context might not be explicitly codified in a single statute, the underlying principles are embedded in contract law duty of good faith and fair dealing, and industry best practices promoted by professional bodies. A thorough impact assessment allows for the identification of actual deviations from the agreed scope or performance standards, the quantification of any resulting negative effects on the client's operations, and the proposal of appropriate remedies, such as adjustments to the final invoice or corrective actions. This proactive and analytical approach minimizes the risk of protracted disputes and potential litigation. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately issue a demand for full payment and threaten legal action. This is professionally unacceptable as it escalates the conflict prematurely and demonstrates a lack of willingness to engage with the client's concerns. It violates the principle of good faith and fair dealing inherent in most contracts and can be seen as an aggressive and unprofessional response, potentially leading to reputational damage and a negative client experience. Ethically, it prioritizes the contractor's immediate financial interest over a fair resolution. Another incorrect approach is to offer a significant, arbitrary discount without a proper assessment of the claimed inefficiencies. This can be seen as an admission of fault where none may exist, or an overcompensation for minor issues. It fails to uphold the contractor's right to be paid for work performed to the agreed standard, and can set a precedent for future unreasonable demands. It lacks the analytical rigor required to determine the true value of any conceded inefficiencies, potentially leading to financial loss for the contractor. A third incorrect approach is to ignore the client's complaints and proceed with final invoicing as if no issues were raised. This is a clear breach of professional conduct and contractual obligations. It demonstrates a disregard for client satisfaction and a failure to address potential problems, which can lead to formal disputes, negative reviews, and damage to the contractor's reputation. Ethically, it is dishonest and unprofessional to proceed without acknowledging and attempting to resolve legitimate client feedback. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a situation should first review the contract thoroughly to understand the scope of work, performance specifications, and dispute resolution clauses. They should then engage in open communication with the client to fully understand the nature and extent of the perceived inefficiencies. The next step is to initiate a formal impact assessment, which involves gathering all relevant project documentation, site data, and performance logs. This assessment should objectively determine if the client's claims are valid, and if so, quantify the impact. Based on the assessment's findings, the contractor can then propose a fair and reasonable resolution, which might include minor adjustments, corrective actions, or a mutually agreed-upon compromise. This systematic and evidence-based approach ensures that decisions are fair, defensible, and aligned with professional and ethical standards, while also protecting the contractor's business interests. Question 16. The investigation demonstrates that a client has expressed a strong desire to significantly alter their investment portfolio based on recent market speculation they encountered. The advisor has a fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest and provide suitable advice. Which approach best addresses the advisor's professional responsibilities in this situation? Option A. Immediately execute the client's requested portfolio changes to honor their expressed wishes and maintain client satisfaction. Option B. Politely decline the client's request, explaining that the advisor's expertise lies in long-term strategies and not in reacting to short-term market speculation. Option C. Conduct a thorough impact assessment of the proposed portfolio changes on the client's overall financial plan, risk tolerance, and long-term objectives, and then present a comprehensive analysis of the implications and alternative strategies. Option D. Present the client with a few portfolio options that largely mirror their initial request, focusing on how to implement their desired changes quickly. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough impact assessment of the proposed portfolio changes on the client's overall financial plan, risk tolerance, and long-term objectives, and then present a comprehensive analysis of the implications and alternative strategies. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preference and the potential for that preference to lead to an unsuitable or even detrimental outcome. The advisor must navigate the client's subjective desires while upholding their fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, which includes providing objective, well-reasoned advice based on a thorough understanding of the client's financial situation and goals. The difficulty lies in balancing client autonomy with professional responsibility, especially when the client's request might stem from incomplete information or emotional bias. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive impact assessment that goes beyond simply fulfilling the client's immediate request. It requires the advisor to thoroughly analyze the potential consequences of the client's preferred course of action on their overall financial well-being, risk tolerance, and long-term objectives. This includes evaluating how the proposed change aligns with their established financial plan, the potential tax implication, liquidity needs, and any other relevant factors. This approach is best professional practice because it demonstrates a commitment to the client's best interests, fulfilling the advisor's fiduciary duty. It aligns with regulatory expectations that advisors provide advice that is suitable and in the client's interest, not merely what the client asks for without critical evaluation. This proactive and analytical stance helps mitigate potential future harm to the client and upholds the integrity of the advisory relationship. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately implementing the client's request without further inquiry. This fails to meet the professional standard of care and fiduciary duty. It suggests a lack of due diligence and an abdication of the advisor's responsibility to provide informed guidance. Ethically, it prioritizes client convenience over client welfare, potentially exposing the client to undue risk or suboptimal outcomes. Regulatory frameworks typically mandate that advice be suitable and based on a thorough understanding of the client's circumstances, which this approach bypasses. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's request outright without understanding the underlying rationale. While the request might be ill-advised, a professional should seek to understand the client's motivations. Dismissal can alienate the client, damage the professional relationship, and prevent the advisor from identifying any legitimate concerns the client may have that could be addressed through alternative, more suitable means. This approach lacks empathy and fails to engage in constructive dialogue, which is crucial for effective client management and advice. A third incorrect approach is to present the client with a limited set of options that all align with their initial, potentially flawed, preference without exploring broader, more suitable alternatives. This approach can be seen as manipulative or as a failure to provide comprehensive advice. It restricts the client's ability to make a truly informed decision by not presenting the full spectrum of possibilities and their respective implications. This falls short of the professional obligation to educate and empower the client with all relevant information for decision-making. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with active listening to understand the client's request and underlying motivations. This should be followed by a comprehensive assessment of the client's current financial situation, goals, and risk tolerance. The potential impact of the proposed action must be thoroughly analyzed, considering all relevant factors. The professional should then present a clear, objective analysis of the implications, including potential benefits and drawbacks, and discuss alternative strategies that may be more suitable. The ultimate decision should be a collaborative one, with the client making an informed choice based on the professional's expert guidance. Question 17. The audit findings indicate a pattern of complex, high-value transactions involving a new client whose business activities appear to be nascent and whose stated source of funds is primarily from overseas investments that are difficult to independently verify. The client is eager to move these funds quickly into various domestic investment vehicles. What is the most appropriate course of action for the compliance officer? Strictly adhering to the Bennett Mechanical Test Advanced Practice Tests Regulatory Framework. Option A. Immediately file a Suspicious Activity Report, SAR, with the relevant authorities without further inquiry, as the complexity and overseas origin of funds are inherently indicative of potential illicit activity. Option B. Accept the client's verbal assurances regarding the legitimacy of their funds and proceed with the transactions to maintain a positive client relationship and facilitate business growth. Option C. Advise the client to diversify their investment strategy to reduce the perceived risk and then proceed with the transactions as originally planned. Option D. Conduct enhanced due diligence to understand the specific nature of the overseas investments, the economic rationale for the rapid movement of funds, and to seek independent verification of the source of wealth before proceeding with any significant transactions. The correct answer is D. Conduct enhanced due diligence to understand the specific nature of the overseas investments, the economic rationale for the rapid movement of funds, and to seek independent verification of the source of wealth before proceeding with any significant transactions. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated intentions and the potential for those intentions to be used for illicit purposes, specifically money laundering. The auditor must navigate this by adhering strictly to the Bennett Mechanical Test Advanced Practice Tests regulatory framework, which emphasizes a risk-based approach and the importance of understanding the client's business and the source of their funds. The challenge lies in balancing the need to facilitate legitimate business transactions with the obligation to prevent financial crime. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the red flags identified by the audit. It involves a thorough due diligence process that goes beyond superficial information. By seeking to understand the source of funds and the economic rationale behind the proposed transactions, the auditor is fulfilling their regulatory obligation to identify and mitigate money laundering risks. This proactive stance aligns with the principles of Know Your Customer (KIC) and anti-money laundering (AML) regulations, which are fundamental to maintaining the integrity of the financial system. The Bennett Mechanical Test Advanced Practice Test Framework mandates such scrutiny when suspicious activity is detected. An incorrect approach that involves accepting the client's explanation at face value without further investigation would be a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This would constitute a dereliction of duty under the Bennett Mechanical Test Advanced Practice Test Guidelines, as it fails to adequately assess and mitigate the risk of facilitating money laundering. It demonstrates a lack of professional skepticism, a critical element in auditing and compliance. Another incorrect approach, such as immediately reporting the client to the authorities without attempting to gather more information or understand the context, could also be problematic. While vigilance is crucial, an overly hasty report without a reasonable basis or a proper internal escalation process might be premature and could damage the client relationship unnecessarily if the concerns are ultimately unfounded. The Bennett Mechanical Test Advanced Practice Test Framework typically encourages a tiered approach to risk management, starting with enhanced due diligence before escalating to external reporting. A third incorrect approach, such as ignoring the audit findings and proceeding with the transaction as if no issues were raised, represents a severe breach of professional conduct and regulatory compliance. This would expose the firm to significant legal and reputational risks, and directly contravene the spirit and letter of the Bennett Mechanical Test Advanced Practice Tests requirements for risk assessment and client onboarding. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Recognizing and documenting red flags. 2. Applying professional skepticism. 3. Initiating enhanced due diligence procedures relevant to the identified risks. 4. Seeking clear and verifiable explanations from the client regarding the source of funds and the purpose of transactions. 5. Escalating concerns internally if explanations are unsatisfactory or further risks are identified. 6. Consulting with compliance or legal departments. 7. Making a final decision on proceeding with the relationship or transaction based on a comprehensive risk assessment, adhering strictly to the Bennett Mechanical Test Advanced Practice Tests Guidelines. Question 18. Performance analysis shows a client who has consistently expressed a desire for capital preservation and low volatility is now requesting a significant allocation to a highly speculative emerging market technology fund, citing a recent news article. The advisor has concerns that this fund's volatility and potential for substantial capital loss do not align with the client's established risk profile and stated objectives. What is the most appropriate course of action for the advisor? Option A. Invest a small portion of the client's portfolio in the speculative fund to satisfy their request without further discussion, assuming it represents a minor deviation from their overall strategy. Option B. Proceed with the investment as requested by the client, as their explicit instruction overrides the advisor's concerns, ensuring the client's immediate wishes are fulfilled. Option C. Conduct a detailed discussion with the client to reevaluate their risk tolerance, financial capacity for loss, and the specific reasons for this sudden shift in investment preference, while clearly outlining the risks and potential downsides of the requested investment. Option D. Advise the client that the requested investment is too risky and refuse to implement the trade, suggesting they seek advice elsewhere if they are determined to proceed. Correct answer is C. Conduct a detailed discussion with the client to reevaluate their risk tolerance, financial capacity for loss, and the specific reasons for this sudden shift in investment preference, while clearly outlining the risks and potential downsides of the requested investment. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated investment objective and the potential risks associated with a particular investment strategy. The advisor must navigate the client's subjective perception of risk against objective market realities and regulatory expectations. Careful judgment is required to ensure the client's best interests are met, aligning with their stated goals and risk tolerance, while adhering to regulatory obligations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, documented understanding of the client's financial situation, investment objectives, and risk tolerance. This aligns with the fundamental principles of client-centric advice, emphasizing suitability and fiduciary duty where applicable. Specifically, it adheres to regulatory frameworks that mandate a comprehensive assessment of client needs before recommending any investment. This ensures that recommendations are not only appropriate but also justifiable and defensible, protecting both the client and the advisor. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the client's expressed desire for aggressive growth without a deeper probe into their capacity for loss would be a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This would violate suitability rules, which require an assessment of risk tolerance beyond mere stated preference. Another incorrect approach, such as proceeding with the aggressive strategy based on the advisor's personal conviction about its potential, without adequately disclosing the heightened risks and potential for significant capital loss, would constitute a failure to provide adequate information and potentially misrepresent the investment's nature. This breaches disclosure requirements and ethical obligations to act with integrity. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured, multi-step approach. 1. Initiate with a comprehensive client discovery process, going beyond surface-level statements to understand their financial capacity, liquidity needs, time horizon, and emotional response to risk. 2. Objectively assess the suitability of any proposed investment against the client's established profile, considering both potential rewards and the full spectrum of risks. 3. Clearly and transparently communicate all associated risks, potential downsides, and the likelihood of achieving stated objectives, using plain language. 4. Document all client interactions, assessments, recommendations, and client decisions thoroughly. 5. If a client insists on a course of action that appears unsuitable, the advisor must explain the risks clearly, document the client's decision to proceed against advice, and consider whether continuing the professional relationship is appropriate. Question 19. The audit findings indicate that the firm's internal policy for the segregation and safeguarding of client assets has not been formally reviewed or updated in over 5 years, and there is a concern that it may not fully align with current regulatory expectations for client money handling and protection. The firm's senior management is deliberating on the appropriate course of action. Which of the following represents the most professionally responsible and compliant approach? Option A. Acknowledge the audit finding but defer any policy review or updates until the next scheduled internal audit cycle, which is 18 months away, to minimize immediate disruption. Option B. Conduct a superficial review of the policy, focusing only on identifying any explicit contraventions of recently enacted regulations, and make only the minimal changes required to address those specific points. Option C. Document the existing policy in the firm's current compliance manual, noting its age, and proceed with business as usual, assuming it remains adequate until a specific regulatory breach occurs. Option D. Immediately initiate a comprehensive review of the internal policy, comparing it against current regulatory requirements and industry best practices for client asset safeguarding, and implement necessary revisions to ensure full compliance and enhanced client protection. Correct answer is D. Immediately initiate a comprehensive review of the internal policy, comparing it against current regulatory requirements and industry best practices for client asset safeguarding, and implement necessary revisions to ensure full compliance and enhanced client protection. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a firm's established internal policies and the evolving regulatory landscape, particularly concerning client asset protection and disclosure. The firm's reliance on an outdated internal policy, which may not fully align with current best practices or regulatory expectations for safeguarding client assets, creates a significant risk. The audit findings highlight a potential gap in the firm's operational controls and adherence to its own governance framework, necessitating a careful and informed decision on how to rectify the situation. Correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes client interests and regulatory compliance above internal inertia. By proactively reviewing and updating the internal policy to reflect current regulatory requirements and industry standards for client asset safeguarding, the firm demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and robust governance. This ensures that client assets are managed with the highest degree of care and transparency, mitigating potential risks of loss or misuse and fostering client trust. Adherence to updated regulations and best practices is a fundamental ethical and professional obligation. An incorrect approach that involves merely documenting the existing policy without addressing its potential shortcomings is professionally unacceptable. This failure to adapt to regulatory changes or industry best practices constitutes a significant ethical lapse, as it knowingly perpetuates a potentially inadequate safeguard for client assets. Such inaction could lead to regulatory breaches, client detriment, and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach, which is to dismiss the audit findings as a minor procedural issue without further investigation or action, is also professionally unsound. This demonstrates a disregard for internal control mechanisms and a lack of commitment to continuous improvement and risk management. It signals a culture that is not aligned with regulatory expectations for diligence and accountability. Finally, an approach that involves selectively implementing changes only to the extent that they are explicitly mandated by a specific, recent regulation, while ignoring broader best practices or the spirit of client asset protection, is also flawed. This narrow interpretation of compliance can leave the firm vulnerable to future regulatory scrutiny or unforeseen risks that are not yet explicitly codified, but are recognized as industry standards for safeguarding client assets. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the audit findings, a comprehensive review of relevant current regulations and industry best practices, and an assessment of the potential risks associated with the current policy. Professionals must then engage in a proactive and transparent process to update internal policies and procedures, ensuring they align with both legal obligations and ethical responsibilities to protect client assets. This involves a commitment to ongoing learning and adaptation within the evolving regulatory environment. Question 20. The monitoring system demonstrates a pattern of unusual transaction volumes and frequencies that deviate from established benchmarks for a specific portfolio segment. These deviations are flagged by the system as potential indicators of market manipulation or significant operational risk. Option A. Immediately halt all trading activity within the affected portfolio segment until the system's alerts can be fully analyzed by an external audit firm. Option B. Initiate a detailed investigation into the flagged transactions, cross-referencing with market data and internal trading logs to determine the nature and cause of the deviations, and document all findings and actions taken. Option C. Issue a general warning to all trading desks about potential system anomalies without specifying the affected portfolio or the nature of the deviations. Option D. Adjust the monitoring system's parameters to exclude the current range of deviations, thereby reducing the number of alerts generated. The correct answer is B. Initiate a detailed investigation into the flagged transactions, cross-referencing with market data and internal trading logs to determine the nature and cause of the deviations, and document all findings and actions taken. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the potential for misinterpreting complex data and the critical need for accurate reporting to regulatory bodies. The firm's obligation to maintain robust internal controls and ensure compliance with the Bennett mechanical test advanced practice test framework requires diligent oversight of all monitoring systems. The advanced nature of the test implies a need for sophisticated understanding of its outputs and potential anomalies. The correct approach involves a systematic review of the monitoring system's alerts, cross-referencing them with underlying transaction data and relevant Bennett mechanical test, advanced practice test guidelines. This ensures that any identified deviations are properly investigated, understood in context, and addressed in accordance with regulatory expectations. It demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing accuracy, thoroughness, and adherence to the specific requirements of the Bennett Mechanical Test Advanced Practice Test Framework, thereby safeguarding against potential compliance breaches and reputational damage. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss alerts without proper investigation, assuming they are false positives. This fails to acknowledge the potential for genuine issues that could lead to regulatory scrutiny or financial misstatements, violating the duty of care and the principles of robust internal control mandated by the Bennett Mechanical Test Advanced Practice Test Framework. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on automated system flags without human oversight and contextual analysis. This overlooks the nuances of financial operations and the possibility of system limitations, potentially leading to the misclassification of transactions or the failure to identify systemic weaknesses, which is a direct contravention of the spirit and letter of the Bennett Mechanical Test Advanced Practice Test Guidelines. Finally, an approach that prioritizes speed over accuracy by implementing immediate corrective actions without a full understanding of the root cause, risks creating further complications or addressing the wrong issue, undermining the integrity of the firm's compliance efforts under the Bennett Mechanical Test Advanced Practice Test. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the specific requirements of the Bennett Mechanical Test Advanced Practice Test. This involves a thorough review of all system-generated alerts, followed by a detailed investigation of any anomalies. The process should include gathering supporting documentation, consulting relevant policies and procedures, and, if necessary, seeking expert advice. The ultimate goal is to ensure that all actions taken are compliant, well-documented, and aligned with the firm's risk management objectives and regulatory obligations.